Hello and welcome everyone, hopefully from the Caribbean and beyond. My name is Jackson Mihm and I am an associate editor with Global Americans. This is your first time joining one of our events. Global Americans is a think tank based in Washington, D.C. with the goal of providing policymakers, academics, civil society leaders, and Western Hemisphere enthusiasts and the like with the tools needed to promote change and build more prosperous inter-American relations. Last year, in an effort to promote further climate-related collaboration between key U.S. and Caribbean actors, Global Americans assembled policymakers, scholars, officials, and civil society representatives to form a high-level working group on climate change in the Caribbean. We are honored and have the privilege of being joined by an esteemed panel today, one of which is a member of our high-level working group, Ambassador Carlos Fuller, but we'd also like to send a warm welcome to Elizabeth Riley. We also want to send a warm welcome and thank you to the Open Society Foundations for their generous support of this initiative. To date, the working group, in conjunction with Global Americans, has published 5 reports with substantive recommendations for key actors in the U.S. and around the region. One of these reports, and the most recent, I should add, covered extreme weather events and resilience building mechanisms. And virtual events like these seek to raise awareness of some of the recommendations of our working group, but more importantly, to highlight what regional actors are doing to promote collaboration under the climate change umbrella. So I want to issue one last thank you to the GA staff members and working group members who helped me prepare for this event, namely Guy Mintel, Adam Ratzlaff, Caio Pereira, and Alejandro Trenki. Now, before we begin, I want to give a more formal introduction to each of our esteemed panelists. So first and foremost, we're very lucky to be joined by Miss Elizabeth Riley, who is the Executive Director of the Caribbean Disaster Emergency Management Agency, or CDEMA. As Executive Director, she is responsible for the overall provision and leadership to CDEMA, including strategic planning, monitoring and evaluation, resource mobilization, financial management, partnership and stakeholder relationships, and corporate communications. That's a long list. She has over 20 years experience at the regional and international levels in various capacities, and she has field experience, including the leadership of deployment teams in the aftermath of Hurricanes Irma and Dorian in 2017 and 19, respectively. At the international level, Ms. Riley has contributed to a range of technical advisory committees and is currently the vice chair of the ICG Caribe Early Warning Systems Group of Experts on Coastal Hazards. She also sits on a number of regional advisory groups, leading implementation efforts on regional strategy for Latin America and the Caribbean, on disaster management in the agriculture and food nutrition sectors. Welcome, Ms. Riley. Secondly, and I shouldn't have said first and foremost, but we are equally privileged to be joined by Ambassador Carlos Fuller, who is the permanent representative of Belize to the United Nations in New York. Prior to his appointment, Ambassador Fuller was the Regional and International Liaison Officer at the Caribbean Community Climate Change Center, or also known as the 3Cs, where his primary responsibility was to coordinate CARICOM member states in the international climate change negotiation process. Ambassador Fuller is a meteorologist by training and was actually the chief meteorologist of the National Meteorological Service of Belize. He holds the George Price Lifetime Achievement Award for Emergency Management and the Officer of the Order of the British Empire for Public Service. He is also a member of the Global Americans Working Group, as we already highlighted, and has been such a great reference point to me and the rest of the team, providing substantive recommendations to guide our latest report as well as past reports. So thank you so much to both of you for joining. And I just want to get into the first question by saying that with or without climate change, extreme weather events will regrettably exist and affect people in the Caribbean as well as the world. But as we highlighted in the report, with rising global temperatures, extreme weather events like hurricanes, like Dorian, like Irma, droughts like the Pan-Caribbean drought, and extreme floods will become more extreme. So today marks the official start date of the Atlantic hurricane season. So I wanted to ask you both, as climate change exacerbates, how prepared do you feel the region is to handle these and other extreme weather events? And what are the lessons learned in recent years? And maybe if you could go forward with some challenges that lie ahead. I know that's quite the question, but if either one, I'll start with Ms. Riley. So if you have any thoughts on that, I'd love to hear them.
Well, first of all, good morning, Jackson, and good morning to Ambassador Fuller, and welcome to all the viewers for today's session. Really happy to be here. So yes, start of the hurricane season. We've got a forecast this year from Colorado State for a slightly below average season with 13 named storms, 6 of which are expected to become hurricanes and 2 of which are expected to be major systems. So you asked the question about how ready do we feel we are as a region to handle extreme weather events. And I think I have to contextualize my answer by saying that we have been seeing definitely increasing complexity in the events that are happening in the Caribbean region, certainly from the climate side, and it's in keeping with the forecasts and predictions that have come forward from Caribbean climate scientists on what we can expect in terms of the change in climate. So in terms of readiness, I think the Caribbean is one of those very unique regions where we have a regional response mechanism under the Caribbean Disaster Emergency Management Agency, which I have the privilege to lead. And it offers a very unique horizontal cooperation arrangement where we draw on national level technical capacity to support regional level response with the assistance of our partners. And if we look at the experiences from past events, I would say that the regional response mechanism has worked reasonably well in addressing events that are, yes, disruptive at the national level, but in terms of the catastrophic events, the system works well, but we do need that international support to assist us. So from the perspective also of the early warning systems, I think the work of the region has been very positive, particularly work for institutions like the Caribbean Institute for Meteorology and Hydrology, where they've really stepped up on modeling capabilities, looking at excess rainfall forecasting up to 48 hours, and that has been very progressive and supportive of the work that we do, and also in doing modeling for things like storm surge and open water wave heights. So I think there's been quite a bit of progress made there. With respect to if we are fully ready, I don't think you're ever fully ready for dealing with events because every event teaches us something new and we have to be open to learning and seeing what additional we can do. So you asked also about lessons from recent years. So maybe I'll just touch on maybe 3 of those. I would say one is that we have to keep on upscaling our capabilities because there's a lot of uncertainty with respect to what we're going to face, particularly from the climate side and what's happening with the climate change. Second, I would say that we need to pay more attention to behavioral science because even as we have improved the early warning systems, sometimes that 4th component of the early warning spectrum, which looks at the preparedness of the populations to a level that they're able to appropriately respond to the early alerts that come out, that doesn't always hold true. So even though the Met services have been doing, I think, a brilliant job in getting that information out, it doesn't always translate into populations taking the actions that they're, it's recommended for them to take. And while there might be some social factors that might impact on that, and we understand that they may not have the means to do so, we're also seeing interesting behavior amongst populations who do have the capacity to take the actions that are suggested. So the behavioral science, I think, is an area for further investigation. And then my third comment on lessons, I think it's about the security dimensions of the events. More and more, what we're seeing is that we do have to integrate from the outset complementary security arrangements for humanitarian actions in the region, because we're seeing a lot of breakdown of law and order. So I think that's absolutely critical. And then the last part of your very complex question was about challenges. And I'll just speak to one, because I know Ambassador Fuller has so much to add to this question as well. I would say it's really about the increasing complexity of what we're seeing in the region. I think this is going to be the major challenge for us. And because the complexity of these events is being seen not only in the Caribbean, but we're also seeing climate events significantly impacting globally, I do believe that as we go forward, that the type of support that we may expect from our traditional external partners, it may not always be there, because down the road, I do see that they will turn attention a lot inwardly to deal with the climate crisis and maybe in their own jurisdiction. So that's it for me.
Well, thank you for breaking down each layer of that multifaceted question. I want to pose the same question to Ambassador Fuller. So how do you feel, how prepared do you feel the region is to handle extreme weather events, and maybe more focusing on Belize? What are the lessons learned by Belize in recent years, and what challenges lie for Caribbean countries like Belize?
Thanks, Jackson. I don't know if I have much more to add than from what Elizabeth just presented. However, I agree fully with her comments. And just to expand on some of them, I think when you look at the Caribbean and Belize, we have made significant advances in our early warning systems compared to what we had in the 1960s, going to the 70s and now. So when an extreme event does pose a threat to us, I think the early warning systems go out very quickly, very early, and people in general are taking action. And so loss of life is generally minimal now at this stage, because people do evacuate. The problem we do have is that we have much more exposure now of our infrastructure, our homes, our institutions are now exposed to it, and we see massive economic damage occurring with each passing year. And this will increase until we can do much more work in the area of preparedness, of doing the proper land use planning, of doing the zoning in place, of recognizing that if we are putting structures in vulnerable areas, we need to consider them as disposable. If, for example, you were to put a restaurant right on the seashore itself, you know that is going to be impacted when the next storm comes along. And so we have to recognize that and putting systems in place to say, guess what, I can afford to lose this infrastructure because I will build it to withstand only a certain category. And I know my major infrastructure, my homes, my schools, my hospitals are going to be much further back in safe grounds and built strong enough to withstand that Category 5 hurricane that we know will affect each of us at some time within the next 100 years. All of us are going to be impacted within the Caribbean by that. So I think we need to plan around that. One of the lessons, one of the impacts we've had only in the past year was a Category 1 hurricane hitting Belize City in last year. So like I said, the warnings were in place, people evacuated. However, people, as I think Elizabeth recognizes, and she said, some will say, oh my goodness, that won't impact me, it's only a Category 1. Well, in fact, in Belize City, a Category 1 does bring a 6-foot storm surge. And so people are not aware of that risk that even that a Category 1 poses in some locations, like a Belize City. And so we lost 500 homes because those were washed away by that storm surge. And we then had to put, I think, 5,000 people in shelters for quite a while until they could be rebuilt. So these local risks need to be conveyed to the populations. And I think there are many communities living along coastal areas who don't realize that risk when a storm hits them directly. So that is one area I think we need to work on. The second area is we have seen significant movement of people now that we never had before. We see all the migration going through Central America, from the Caribbean, from Cuba, Haiti, Venezuela, moving through, and they're moving into areas, new areas for them, and they don't realize that risk, that they have left one risk, but they're going to another risk area that they may not have the historical experience of dealing with. We have to educate these people also. So that's another area we have to deal with. With climate change, we're seeing much more, many more extreme events than we had before. And so that's an area we need to look at, but also the rapid intensification. When I went to college to do meteorology, the rule of thumb was that it took a day to go from a depression to go to a storm, one more day to go a category 1, another day to a category 2, another day. Now it's within 24 hours, you can go from nothing to a category 5. That is the massive, the explosive development we see as these warm pools of water in the Gulf of Mexico and in the Caribbean exist. These systems just blow up right in front of you and hit you. And again, so we need to take that into account. And then finally, we're going into the hurricane season, true. But another area we need to look at are the off-season events. The sudden rainfall events that we never saw before, a Christmas storm, intense rainfall event, or over the New Year's, outside of the hurricane season. It is something that we now need to get to factor into account, and to be always prepared now for almost an intense rainfall event with consequent flooding, landslides, erosion occurring very quickly. And that's something I think we need to work on also. Thanks.
Thank you both. In terms of behavioral response, and this is more of a thought aloud, but I should also say that for any of our guests today, feel free to use the chat box to raise any questions, and we will allot some time at the end to ask a few questions from the audience. But just a thought aloud in terms of behavioral responses, I do wonder that if COVID has affected how governments talk to local populations, and whether people actually how people in turn take that advice from governments. It's just a thought. Feel free to take it or leave it. But I wanted to get into my next question to Ms. Riley. Being that CDEMA is the main regional organization in charge of providing risk management strategies, it plays a vital role in the Caribbean. In some of the jurisdictions that CDEMA operates, the national capacity is much lower. So I wanted to ask, in terms of places like Haiti, for example, if in the aftermath of storms like Hurricane Matthew in 2016, could you just tell us more about CDEMA's work and what response mechanisms are in place to make sure that humanitarian and other aid is dispersed?
Yeah, thanks so much for the question, Jackson. So CDEMA's work is really about building resilience to the hazards that face the region. And this is hazards in the full context, both those that occur naturally, those that are technologically based, as well as those that may be biological, which are health-related hazards, things like COVID, as you mentioned. So in doing so, the work of CDEMA is really anchored in a regional strategy called Comprehensive Disaster Management, which we have been implementing along with our states and with the support of our partners, both regional and international, since 2001. And we're in the third iteration of that strategy, which is running right now up to 2024. So if I delve into it a little bit more, CDEMA does not deliver on the whole strategy, but there are aspects that we treat under the strategy, and the strategy covers all aspects of the disaster management cycle. So I'll highlight probably just a few areas that we address, and then say a little bit about the regional response mechanism. So we look at the enabling environment for resilience building. For us, this is foundational. We refer to it as our comprehensive disaster management blueprint. So we support our states with policy that's designed for resilience building, looking at legislative requirements, including the supportive regulations. And in both regards, we provide guidance documents to our states on the development of those things. We also support our countries in national level prioritization across the disaster management spectrum. So we have a process that we go through with them called the development of country work programs, where we assess or measure where countries are at through an instrument called the Comprehensive Disaster Management Audit. And it will show up areas where a country is operating well, where additional work is required, or maybe areas where work has not started at all, which are significant gaps. So these are all areas where we support our states. If we look specifically at the different areas of the disaster management cycle, on the preparedness side, I'll just highlight a few. We work extensively on early warning systems along with our technical partners. These include Caribbean Institute for Meteorology and Hydrology, the Caribbean Public Health Agency as it relates to health-related hazards, and also the Seismic Research Center of the University of the West Indies as it relates to seismic hazards. We work with them on administering early warning systems checklists to see where countries are at. We work with them on policy guidance, developing roadmaps to implement those types of activities. We do exercises, support the development of national plans, and we set standards for doing all of these things. If you look at the area of recovery, this is the most recent addition to the areas that CDEMA has added to its technical interventions. And we've been very strategic on what we work on with respect to recovery. We're really trying to support the building of capacity for recovery. So what does that really mean? We work with countries on planning to recover and putting arrangements in place on how recovery will proceed ahead of catastrophic events occurring. So we've prepared what is called a model national recovery framework, and we've assisted a number of our countries in adapting that. And I think our audience will know well that recovery is in essence a national responsibility. So we deal with the capacity building aspects, but we also are working with partners to sort of smooth those arrangements and get better coordination to recovery arrangements. So for example, we have a thematic group that looks at recovery financing, which is coordinated by the CRIF and the Caribbean Development Bank. And that brings together the regional as well as the international financial institutions to help countries understand that whole financing landscape around recovery. And we're working with other partners on knowledge management to build that body of knowledge on recovery as well. So CDEMA is not leading everything in those areas. When it comes to areas of mitigation, we work a lot through our partners and do a lot of advocacy in this regard. So most recently, we've been working with CrossQ, Caribbean Development Bank, and the Organization of Eastern Caribbean States on preparing a new code of practice for constructing low-cost, hurricane-resistant up to Cat 5 winds and earthquake-resistant up to 7.5 on the Richter scale designs for households. And for us, these are really important game-changing interventions because this code of practice document is now going to be applied and taught in our post-secondary institutions across the region, teaching contractors and other persons who work in building these techniques so that they can integrate them into the work that they do. So that's just an example on the mitigation side. And then finally, on the response side, And this is a big component of the work that we do, and probably the area that we're best known for, even though there's a lot of other work that CDEMA does, as I just explained. So we have a regional response mechanism. It's a horizontal cooperation arrangement, which basically we coordinate along with our partners. And we train through our regional training center, nationals across our 19 participating states in various disciplines. And when a territory is impacted, we are able to draw personnel basically from countries that are not impacted and take them into spaces that have been impacted to provide that kind of surge support. And you would realize this is really important in the context of small states where there are limited resources. Under this arrangement, we also coordinate jointly with the UN system. In fact, the coordination platform, it's called the Caribbean Development Partner Group. And we come together whenever there's an event. It's UN agencies, it's regional agencies, NGOs, private sector. And it's a platform where we bring key information on what has happened as a result of the impact of a particular event. So for example, we pulled this group together after Hurricane Lisa in Belize last year. It's informed by the reports coming out of Belize on what the impact has been, what are the needs that are emerging. We bring that into that space, and then the partners have an opportunity to discuss and give indications on what type of support they can provide. And we do try to do so in a coordinated way. So we activate that mechanism for events like the Lisa in Belize, but also more significant or larger events, I should say, like the volcanic eruption in St. Vincent and the Grenadines, or catastrophic events such as Irma and Maria back in 2017, or even Dorian in 2019. So there's a whole suite of interventions that are undertaken by CDEMA. In addition, we support our states through resource mobilization. We act as the centralized point of discussion and negotiation with international partners who want to support the region in the area of resilience building. So we work with the CARICOM Secretariat to support that. We are a conduit for financial resources, which are then transmitted onto our participating states. And advocacy is really critical. And we represent also in international spaces, supporting, for example, the Caribbean Community Climate Change Center in preparations for the upcoming conference of parties. So there's a real wide mandate that is executed by the agency.
Thank you so much for providing me that thorough overview of CDEMA's activities and implementation and coordination, and just a wide-ranging set of interventions that are really at your helm. I wanted to say, because you touched on the UN platform and as well as the dispersion of resources to member countries, and turn it to Ambassador Fuller, access to climate finance mechanisms, including for resilience building, remains a chief concern for countries on the local, for countries and local municipalities. So Ambassador Fuller, I wanted to ask, what kind of initiatives are Caribbean countries advocating for at international fora like the UN? And what is your opinion about new agreements like the new loss and damage agreement? And what challenges do you see in terms of implementation in a robust way?
Thanks for the question, Jackson. And that's an area that that the Caribbean and all small island states in general are really trying to address. Yes, under the Climate Change Convention, we have established various financing vehicles. The convention has a financial mechanism with two operating entities, the Global Environmental Facility, the GEF, and the Green Climate Fund. However, getting access to these funds is quite elaborate, and it takes a significant amount of time and human resources to actually develop, to get the funding. So, for example, with the GCF, it'll take you at least 2 years to go from a concept paper that you've submitted to the GCF and to actually get the funds and start to disperse funding. So it takes quite a while. The good thing about that is that a GCF project, well planned and that does deliver, provides significant resources, things in the tens of millions of dollars. So you can get a significant project out of it. There are smaller funds, for example, the adaptation fund, but that limits you to under $10 million to get for resources. And so our big ask now is, yes, we've established these funds, but number one, the process of getting the actual money takes too long. And by the time you actually get the resources, your entire, the concept may have changed altogether. Your reality may have changed by the time you get those resources. So we need to look at that aspect. Secondly, being small island states, we are usually getting the smaller part of the funding that is available with it. The larger countries, an India, a Brazil, South Africa gets a land share of these resources. So we are really marginalized with it. And that's an area we're trying to address. Can we get some earmarked funds for small island developing states? That is what we actually need to put in place. And then finally, with the new loss and damage financing facility that was established. So there are two aspects of it. First one has to do with the existing resources and the existing multilateral development banks. They need to put resources in place. The World Bank, the IMF, the IDB needs to have funding in place for us to access funds separately already. Put that in place. The institutions exist. Let's put money there that we can access to address loss and damage now. Secondly, we have established a loss and damage financing facility, a separate mechanism. We are now at the incipient stage of what that system should be. And so it's at the planning stage now. And indeed, what we want to have in place is a system that will respond to existing impacts of an extreme event. We don't want a fund that will address planning, that will address adaptation measures, that will address early warning systems. There are already systems in place that provide that. We want funding in place that will address what happened in Belize with Hurricane Lisa, what happened in the Bahamas, what happened in Dominica, what happened in Barbuda. We need a fund in place to provide resources there to address the loss and damage that has occurred, not to plan for the next one. So that is a system that we need now to put in place. And we're at the beginning stage of that. And hopefully at COP28 in the UAE in December, that system will actually be put in place. And finally, there is now the Santiago Network on Loss and Damage. And the host of that is going to be decided at this upcoming COP. And we have the Caribbean Development Bank has actually put in one of the two bids to host that network. It would be fantastic indeed if that could be placed in an area that is being affected by these major events. And I think that would show that indeed the region can host such a system, that we recognize the realities of our area, and indeed the resources should come to an institution like the CDB that can disperse this money immediately to these small island developing states. Thanks.
Another great question. So what we're thinking of is great response. What we're talking about are questions of speed of dispersion of funds, earmarking funds separately for small island development states, and then also, addressing existing loss and damages. And it would be great if international fora actually came to the region and some of the places affected by extreme weather events. I wanted to continue with the topic of international fora and then open it up for panelist questions or audience questions, because I see we already have 3 great questions. My last question will be on the Sendai framework. For those who are unaware, the framework is an intergovernmental process from 2015 to 2030 designed to build resilience. And the midterm review was just last month in the Caribbean, I believe, in Punta Cana. Correct me if I'm wrong. But Ms. Riley and Ambassador Fuller, I wanted to ask, where do you think the region is in terms of the targets set forth by the Sendai framework, and where do you think the major successes and places to focus on for the second half of the framework period lie? And I'll start with Ms. Riley.
Okay, thanks so much for that question, Jackson. So the high-level midterm review of the Sendai framework actually took place in New York. Yeah, just about 2 weeks or so now. And, it's really a very important global process. For us in the Caribbean, we implement the Sendai framework actually through our comprehensive disaster management strategy, which I mentioned when we started the session. And this is a globally recognized pathway at the level of the UN DRR as well. So where are we in terms of the targets? Well, we also completed a midterm review of our own CDM strategy in preparation for that midterm review. And a lot of the findings were actually quite similar. So one of the things that really jumped out is really related to the slow pace of acceleration of gathering risk knowledge. And this is a global challenge. And similarly, we see it in the Caribbean as well, because really we want our actions to be informed by the best evidence base that we can have. And this is an area where we have made a little bit of progress, but certainly not to the extent that we would like to. For the Caribbean, in terms of success areas, definitely on the side of the early warning systems. In fact, when we had the first regional launch of the UN Secretary General's early warning systems for all initiative, and this took place in Barbados in February of this year, one of the things that we acknowledge in the presentations, including by the Honorable Mihm Motley, who was one of the keynote speakers, and also by Prime Minister Pierre of St. Lucia, was that the Caribbean has really undertaken a lot of innovative actions in moving early warning systems forward at the policy level, but also with respect to treating early warning systems explicitly through disaster management legislation, and also through the implementation of diverse initiatives at the national level. We have significant capability, as was referenced both by myself and Ambassador Fuller on the scientific side, through really increased capabilities, not only of our regional institutions, CIMH, but also the national Met services, I think, have been coming along. We know there's a much further way for them to go, but there's been so much in terms of positives on that side, and also trying to look at stepping up early warning for other types of hazards as well. So I think those are some of the pluses. In terms of where we need to sort of focus on for the second half of the period, I think one of the realities is that COVID-19 has had a significant impact on the pace of the implementation of the Sendai framework. And this has been a global reality, and it has been very acute, I would say, here in the Caribbean, because of course the national systems, we have limited human capacity, but the national systems essentially pivoted to zero in specifically on COVID. And many of the, I would say, programmed developmental interventions that might have been scheduled as a part of the national level strategies, et cetera, did not move at the pace that we wanted to see. And similarly with projects, et cetera, that were scheduled for the Caribbean for that period of time. So in terms of the second half of the Sendai framework period, I think this issue of human capacity is really important. It is particularly important and acute for small island developing states. We need to invest more in the development of the human capacity in our states to bring about implementation. I think we also need to really deal with this issue of, how do we improve resilience? And the slow pace of the implementation of the Paris Agreement is a major issue for us, because the question is really about resilience to what? And the answer to that is a moving goalpost, right? It's a shifting goalpost, particularly with respect to the facts that we saw coming out of the last IPCC reports last year, where they're essentially saying we are going to exceed the target of the 1.5. We are going to continue to see greater extremes with respect to the climate-related events. So when we are discussing building resilience, we have to understand, what are we building that resilience to? And I think for the Caribbean, this is really a critical issue for discussion as we really look at these issues of strategic foresight for the next half of the Sendai period. And I think our climate scientists are doing a good job in trying to give us, as the technical practitioners, a better handle on this. But as I said, the goalpost is moving, and this is going to be a major challenge for us going forward. And finally, I would speak on the financial issues. And, Ambassador Fuller was very eloquent in speaking to this. And we are going to continue to see extreme loss and damage in this region. There's just no getting away from it, especially as we've agreed in principle the 1.5 will be exceeded. So this is not going to stop. And the financial resources required to recover from these events, it is significant in the Caribbean context. When you talk about single events or complex events that can result in damage at a value of 300% of the gross domestic product of a state, this is, I don't know if countries that don't sit within a small island context can fully get your heads around the reality of what one of these events can do in a small state's context. So financial resources to bring us to a place where adaptation is at a level that we know it needs to be, that when we get affected by events, whether they be climate only based or complex events, which are combinations of climate plus other types of hazards, the ability to recover from these events, these are the types of capacities that we have to put in place and to have the appropriate financial resources to treat them.
Thank you for that intervention, and also putting into context with the last bit what it means for some small island states, especially saw that in Antigua and Barbuda, and in the past in Dominica as well. And I just want to ask the same question with regards to Belize. How is Belize looking at pursuant to the Sendai agreement, and what are some of the resilience efforts that it's taking?
Sure. Thanks, Jackson. And let me say that I think Ms. Riley really covered all the aspects dealing with the Sendai framework, of which she's intimately knowledgeable about it. However, in New York, as we were preparing for it, two things came out very quickly. A, there's a lack of data in most of our countries to actually produce reports to go into the Sendai framework. And as a result of that, the analysis was really skewed poorly for small and developing states. We were unable to provide data to feed into the analysis of where we are to do a proper analysis of how we are actually living up to the Sendai framework. And so if we look at in Belize from two aspects, and I think it's true across the Caribbean. Yes, we score very well for the early warning systems we have now put in place, and so our communities are ready. But as Elizabeth said, we now need to look at the human dimension of it, of how our people are interpreting these warnings. How vulnerable are they? And they may see it, oh, it'll happen to the next person, or you know, I'm safe where I am, and so on. So I think being able to translate that into response is going to be crucially important, and I think that is where we need to address within Sendai. And then secondly, in putting the resilience systems in place. Yes, we have taken certain things already through the support from, for example, Taiwan. We have now put in another shelter in the extreme west of the country, putting in early warning systems for flooding. Belize City now has some infrastructure in place to deal with flooding, using the canals properly, and to pump out water before the rivers come down and flood it. So some of these early warning systems are put in place, and some of the resilience measures are in place. However, we need to do a lot more in our zoning, in our land use planning. That has to be put in place properly, and governments need to be convinced of the importance of doing it. In some countries, there is just not the land available to do it properly, possibly. But there are countries like, for example, Belize, Guyana, Suriname, where there is enough land in place that we can put in the proper structures in place to be able to reduce the direct impact on these communities. So I think there's some areas that we can certainly work on, and I think hopefully in the second half of the decade we can work on that.
I want to turn it over to audience questions and start with one from Raj, because it dovetails really well with what you just said, Ambassador Fuller. Not all countries in the region necessarily have the resources Belize does in terms of land use. But you know, considering climate change as a trigger, and when we're thinking about the people aspect of how responses to extreme weather happen, do you foresee, and I'll start with Ms. Riley, situations where coastal populations in the region need to be resettled, and to what extent? I know adaptation is not primarily CDEMA's work, but what plans does the region have in terms of resettling populations who might be or are likely to be displaced?
Yeah, thanks so much. This is such a great question. And you know, when Ambassador Fuller talked earlier about, you know, some of the things that we're seeing, he talked about this issue of displacement. And we can also add the aspect of relocation to it. And it's a big issue. And part of the reason why just last year, CDEMA signed off a memorandum of understanding with the International Organization for Migration, because we realize that we have to get ahead of this issue. So do we foresee a situation where coastal populations have to be resettled? Absolutely, yes. And I dare say this has already started in some areas where we are seeing severe coastal erosion is a reality for a number of our participating states. And I think countries are already thinking in this direction. I do think that we have to give a lot more attention to it, though, in the broader adaptation conversation, because with the sea level rise, and I know for Caribbean, and Ambassador Fuller can correct me because I know he is really the expert on this. I seem to recall that the 2020 State of Caribbean Climate Report had indicated up to one meter sea level rise being anticipated as an average across the Caribbean. Of course, there are variations across different states, and a 1 meter sea level rise in the context of some of the very low-lying states, particularly those that are limestone based, some of the islands, for example, of Turks and Caicos, if you've been there, Anguilla, some of the islands of the Bahamas, you know, which are really coral in their geological origin, and they're quite low-lying. Areas of the Cayman Islands, if you visited there, a 1 meter sea level rise is significant. So I think as a part of the developmental strategy of a number of the states going forward, this is increasingly going to be a part of the conversation.
Thank you so much for providing that forward-thinking response. I want to ask the same question, more or less, if Belize has taken measures in the past or in the future, and if you foresee areas where people will have to be resettled due to displacements. Thank you, and yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, sure, Jackson. So in fact, we have several communities in Belize along the coast right now. One of them that comes to mind right away is Monkey River, where they have lost all their beaches, their beach already. They've lost 2 rows of houses. The cemetery is now underwater. And people are losing everything, and they will have to move at some point. Fortunately, we have now had projects with the IOM where we have actually done surveys to ask people, when you have to move, tell us what it is that what will be required, because it is going to be very unfortunate if we have a top-down approach to go to communities to tell them, look, we are now moving you from here to there without their inputs. So we are now engaging with them with the discussions of how they will be able to change where they're living, their livelihoods. Can a coastal community, which depends on fishing or coastal tourism, move into the forest? How will they actually survive in such an environment? So we are now thinking of this into account. What is also very important to realize is how acute this system is going to become very quickly. There is alarming science now coming out of what is now occurring at the glaciers. The glaciers are melting at an alarming rate that it is quite possible that by 2050, we will see that 3-foot rise of sea level, 1 meter rise of sea level. If that does occur, and I've seen the maps for Belize, 3/4 of Belize City goes underwater. We've lost basically all our islands basically disappear. So we're going to see all these people have to move inland, and then you then have to move into areas that should be for agriculture, may have to be turned into communities for people to live. So a tremendous displacement will be occurring, and it's going to be occurring in the lifetimes of this next generation. So it is not something far into the future anymore. And that is what is alarming, that we now have to start to plan very early. And as Elizabeth said, there are some communities in the Caribbean, the Bahamas, the Cayman Islands, Turks and Caicos. It's going to be affecting their entire country. So we have to look at actually maybe having entire states move in the next few decades.
You both, and I just want to say that of all the policy interventions, reducing carbon emissions, especially from large industrial nations, is what our project is framed on, and all of our papers are done with the understanding that that would be the most comprehensive and important policy intervention to do. I'm going to close the discussion with this one kind of final framing question. What are your hopes as we look toward the next decade for both CDEMA, for both Belize, and the region in general in terms of resilience building? And I'm going to start with Elizabeth.
Yeah, thanks very much. So what are the hopes? I think the hopes are deeply enshrined in the new strategy document that we just prepared for CDEMA. And this is really focused on strengthening the capacities at the national level. For me, this is absolutely key. CDEMA's philosophy really is one of building our states, and we want to see the needle moving on all areas of the disaster management cycle when we do our audits every 3 years. This is really an aspiration. 2, I would say that we want to have a regional response mechanism. This is on the response side, which is really built out to what we're calling the next level. And by this, I mean that we take into account what our climate scientists are telling us in terms of what we are going to expect in 10, 20, 30 years. And we build an additional layer of capability, particularly through investment in our regional militaries, because as I said before, I have a sense, and in watching the trends, that there's going to be a lot more inward turning from traditional partners. And it means that the levels of self-reliance within small regions that are comprised of small states like ours, will have to be increased. And third and final, I would say that looking at the institution, CDEMA itself, we definitely want to see a stronger CDEMA, a more technically capable organization in a better position to serve the region, and an organization which has a more firm financial footing. And we have some great plans in place that we're hoping to execute. And, you know, we want to continue working with all of our partners to get this done. So thanks again, you know, for the opportunity to participate today and to have the honor of talking alongside Ambassador Fuller, who have worked with us for such a long time. And thanks to Global Americas.
Thank you so much for that. I'm going to turn the same question over to Ambassador Fuller.
Thanks, Jackson. And let me also say it's been a pleasure working with you and Elizabeth over the years, indeed, on this whole issue. And I'd like to address that question by responding to 3 of the questions posed in the chat that we're not able to get to. So, for example, we begin with the issue of the United States and the collaboration with them. In fact, we have great collaboration with the U.S. government institutions at various levels, and I think it is because of the fact that we are at the front door of any system that will affect the U.S. So they have actually assisted us in strengthening our early warning systems. It assists us, but it also assists them in getting ready for them as the system passing through the Caribbean quite likely will end up hitting either the U.S. East Coast or the Gulf of Mexico. So they have provided significant resources through the National Hurricane Center, through the Hurricane Committee, through the U.S. Weather Service and NOAA in strengthening our observing systems across the Caribbean. Secondly, we do have great support through U.S. Southern Command in preparing, and we have these exercises regularly with our emergency management officials and U.S. Southern Command in getting ready to prepare and to respond to systems hitting the Caribbean. So we work very closely with U.S. Southern Command and with USAID in recovery efforts and preparing for it. So we have great collaboration. We need to expand that collaboration, however, indeed, to address the issue you mentioned, Jackson. The U.S. needs to reduce their emissions of greenhouse gases much more than they have planned for already. Yes, this administration has made efforts in that regard, but much more needs to be done. And I think it is an issue that the next election, the U.S. election, needs to respond to next year, and hopefully a much more informed U.S. population that will provide the proper answers. Because the issues that we spoke about on migration in the Caribbean, in South America, in Central America, and across the world will affect the U.S. eventually, if indeed the mitigation actions do not occur in the U.S. and among all the major emitters around the world. So they need to look at that very early to reduce emissions, and hence the issue of migration would be actually go down, and they will not have to respond in the way to adaptation and to loss and damage because of low mitigation efforts. So we need to look at that aspect. The second one had to do with nature-based solutions. In Belize, indeed, we are taking that very seriously. We floated a blue bond, and which was picked up by the international community. So we now have marine parks being funded to conserve our marine resources through the blue bond. So that was well received. we take forest conservation very seriously. And so, in fact, 60% of Belize's land remains under some sort of forest protection. So indeed, and we're going to continue working in those areas because it does strengthen the natural resilience through the mangroves, through the seagrass beds. We do indeed strengthen our resilience to extreme weather events. And then finally, the wealthy expats who come to Belize and across the Caribbean to live. They have chosen to live in areas that are exposed to extreme events. So in fact, they need to consider putting in measures to invest in our resilience measures, because we are actually protecting their property, their investments. So indeed, I think they need to contribute much more in assisting us in building resilience. It is for our benefit, but also their investments.
Thank you both for your time and really insightful responses. I think this has been a comprehensive discussion on and hopefully ended on a note that's a little bit more positive. I wanted to also thank the Open Society Foundations for their generous support of our climate change in the Caribbean programming. But again, thank you to both of our panelists. I appreciate your time, and to everyone in the audience, thanks for coming today, and have a good one.
Thank you to all.